It was supposed to be a ceremonial gathering, but when the Global Royal Council met behind closed doors in Geneva, whispers turned into a decision that would shake the monarchy's very core and send Queen Camilla storming out in fury. Geneva, long known as a city of quiet negotiations and guarded secrets, was hosting an assembly unlike any other. The Global Royal Council, a body so steeped in tradition and veiled in discretion that even seasoned royal watchers rarely glimpsed its workings, had convened in full force. This was the apex of royal diplomacy, an alliance of sovereign representatives from across the Commonwealth, bound not by political obligation alone, but by the weight of centuries-old bonds. Their meetings were usually grand but uneventful, carefully choreographed to showcase stability. But not this time. This time, beneath the polished courtesies and the formal greetings, there was a current of tension sharp enough to cut through marble. In the days leading up to the gathering, the whispers had grown louder. Reports filtered through private channels that the council's agenda was not simply ceremonial. There was talk of a shift in the crown, an unsettling phrase that no one dared to define outright. Some speculated about adjustments in royal duties across the Commonwealth, others about a new vision for the monarchy's leadership, and there were those, a small but insistent minority, who claimed the meeting would determine a successor in a way that could override even Buckingham Palace's own declarations. Catherine, Princess of Wales, had arrived in Geneva with her signature composure. In the years since stepping into the royal spotlight, she had built an influence far beyond the confines of the United Kingdom. Presidents, prime ministers, and foreign dignitaries found her both approachable and commanding, a rare balance that spoke of leadership not yet officially hers, but undeniably present. She carried herself not as a contender for power, but as someone already trusted with it. That, more than anything, unsettled those who saw her as a quiet threat. Camilla, Queen Consort, entered with the assured presence of a woman who had fought for her place and held onto it despite storms that might have broken others. She had endured the glare of public judgment, the comparisons to a predecessor whose legacy still hovered like a shadow, and the test of stepping into a role many believed she was never meant to have. For her, this council meeting was another opportunity to assert her rightful position, to prove she was the monarchy's unwavering anchor in an uncertain era. But then came the first sign that this gathering would not follow the expected script. As the council members filed into the grand chamber, their seating was determined not merely by alphabetical order or by nation, but by precedence, an ancient protocol that spoke volumes without uttering a word. Catherine's place was at the head of the right-hand table, a position of honor reserved for those the council deemed essential to the future of the monarchy. Camilla, though still seated in the front row, was placed to the left, a symbolic demotion in a room where symbols meant everything. It was subtle enough to be defended as formality, yet deliberate enough to send a message. From that moment, the atmosphere seemed to tighten. Pleasantries were exchanged, hands shaken, and prepared statements delivered with diplomatic grace. But beneath it all ran a silent drumbeat. Something was coming. The veterans of council politics recognized the rhythm. It was the prelude to revelation, the hush before the fall of an unseen hammer. And then, as the murmurs of polite conversation faded, a single object commanded the attention of all. An aged envelope, marked with the unmistakable royal crest of Queen Elizabeth II, was carried into the chamber. The chair of the council spoke briefly, framing it as a matter of historical significance that required immediate consideration. The eyes of the delegates sharpened. The whispers stopped entirely. But the real storm was still gathering, and the first thunderclap came when an ancient decree, long buried in royal archives, was unexpectedly read aloud to the council. Locked away for decades, a parchment sealed with Queen Elizabeth II's personal crest emerged from a velvet case, and its words would turn the royal order upside down. The chief archivist of the Global Royal Council stepped forward, his hands steady but his voice carrying the weight of history. Before him rested a document many in the room had only heard whispered about in obscure royal circles, a decree signed in the twilight years of Queen Elizabeth's reign, preserved in secrecy, until the moment deemed most critical. That moment, it seemed, had arrived. The silence was absolute as he broke the wax seal, the faint crack of it sounding almost like the breaking of a chain that had kept the monarchy's deepest contingency locked away. The archivist began to read, his words deliberate, measured, each one heavy with implication. The decree spoke of the Queen's personal vision for safeguarding the stability of the crown in the face of any crisis that might fracture the monarchy. It was not a standard procedural document. This was personal, crafted with the meticulous care of a sovereign who had weathered more storms than any monarch before her. It addressed not the present she had ruled over, but the future she could only anticipate. The deeper he read, the more the council members leaned forward. Here was the outline of a succession plan designed to bypass chaos in the event of a generational rupture, a moment when the traditional line of inheritance might not serve the greater good. And then came the clause, the one that sent a shockwave through the chamber. It named Catherine, Princess of Wales, as monarch regent, should the monarchy face a crisis of unity or legitimacy. Not Camilla, not anyone else. Catherine, by Elizabeth's own hand. Gasps rose from the delegates, the sound rippling like wind across water. Even among the most seasoned royals present, few could mask their astonishment. This was no vague suggestion, it was a clear directive, an intentional safeguard placed in the hands of a woman Elizabeth had evidently seen as the embodiment of the monarchy's future. The revelation carried not only the weight of the Queen's authority, but also her unmistakable judgment of character. Camilla sat motionless, but those closest to her saw it, the tightening of her jaw, the slight narrowing of her eyes. It was the earliest glimpse of something sharper beneath her polished exterior. This was not simply about protocol or precedence anymore. This was about identity, power, and the knowledge that, in the most critical scenario, the late Queen had chosen someone else to lead. The sting was sharper for being made public in this hall of global royal voices. For Catherine, the moment was not one to celebrate openly. She listened without reaction, her gaze steady, her hands resting calmly before her. Yet beneath that composure, she must have felt the enormity of what had just been declared. In a single reading, the council, and indeed the watching world, now knew that her name had been written into history, not as a mere consort to a future king, but as the monarch's appointed safeguard. The decree concluded, the archivist's voice fading into a silence that felt thicker than the walls around them. This was no ordinary piece of paper. It was a relic of authority, an echo of a monarch's foresight, and a spark that threatened to ignite the most personal of battles within the royal family. The ink on the parchment may have dried decades ago, but for Camilla, the wound it opened was fresh and cutting deep. Those in the room say they could feel it, an invisible tension radiating from Camilla as she gripped her chair, her knuckles white, every muscle tight with unspoken rage. She did not speak, but her silence carried a weight heavier than any outburst could have. Her back remained straight, her expression carefully composed, yet there was a sharpness in her stillness that made even seasoned diplomats glance her way. It was the kind of silence that doesn't come from calm, it comes from control, from holding back a tide that threatens to break. For Camilla, moments like these were nothing new. Her journey into the royal family had been one long battle for legitimacy. She had endured the whispers, the headlines, the endless comparisons to Diana, a ghost that refused to leave the halls of Buckingham Palace. Every public appearance had been a test. Every official engagement, an opportunity for critics to dissect her presence and measure her against a memory she could never replace. She had learned to fight without drawing her sword, to endure without showing her wounds. But here, in this chamber, the fight had taken a new form. As the words of the decree still lingered in the air, the sting of betrayal was undeniable. This was not just a protocol dispute, it was a direct statement from the late Queen herself, written in ink decades earlier, that in a moment of crisis, Camilla was not to be the monarchy's anchor. That role, that trust, that symbolic crown had been given to Catherine. And the choice was not subtle. It was public, endorsed now by the most powerful royal representatives in the world. Her mind flashed back to other moments of quiet humiliation. The frosty receptions in certain Commonwealth nations, the subtle but pointed absences of her name in key public addresses, the rare but stinging moments when senior royals, especially Anne, had voiced their preference for Catherine in delicate matters of diplomacy. She had survived those slights by telling herself they were temporary. But this was permanent. Across the table, Catherine sat with the same serene composure that had made her a global favorite. She smiled as she listened to the proceedings, offering nods of gratitude to the delegates who congratulated her. There was no gloating, no overt show of triumph, and that, perhaps, was even more infuriating. Was Catherine truly so oblivious to the magnitude of what had just happened? Or was this calm an act, a way to appear untouched, while Camilla's composure was being tested in front of the world? In the shadows of the chamber, Camilla's aides were busy. Quietly, discreetly, messages began to flow from their devices, coded words urging her to stay composed and not let them see the reaction. They knew how dangerous a visible crack could be. Camilla's public image had been forged in resilience. To shatter here would be to hand her critics the very moment they had been waiting for. So, she kept her eyes steady, her breathing measured, and her fury locked behind an impenetrable mask. But beneath that mask, the calculations had already begun. This was not a fight to be waged in the open. This would be answered in corridors, in phone calls, in carefully placed words that could shift alliances and unsettle Catherine's newfound position. Camilla was no stranger to political warfare, and she would not allow herself to be written out of the monarchy's future without a fight. But the council was far from finished, and the next announcement would push Camilla beyond the point of no return. One by one, the council members raised their hands. Each vote felt like a hammer blow, and Camilla could feel the ground shifting beneath her throne. The chamber, already heavy with tension, now pulsed with the kind of stillness that comes only before a monumental decision. This was not a routine endorsement. This was history being rewritten in real time, and every arm lifted in the air was chiseling Catherine's name deeper into the monarchy's future. The process was formal, bound by ancient rules and strict decorum. No speeches of dissent, no overt campaigning, just a solemn ritual in which each delegate was called to cast their stance. In this room, silence did not mean indifference, it meant resolve. And as the voting began, it became clear which way the tide was moving. The early hands were raised without hesitation, their reasons echoing in prior closed-door discussions. The need for global unity, the desire for a monarch who can bridge tradition and modern leadership. Catherine had become the embodiment of that vision. Camilla sat still, her eyes fixed ahead, but the faint tightening of her mouth betrayed the blow each raised hand delivered. The words that had once been whispered in back corridors were now being formalized into consensus. This wasn't just the will of a few ambitious figures, it was the overwhelming decision of the monarchy's most influential body. And with each show of support, her own standing shrank, not in title, but in authority. For Catherine, the moment demanded the utmost control. She offered no displays of triumph, no glance of satisfaction toward her rival. Instead, she remained a portrait of dignity, a quiet nod of acknowledgement to each vote in her favor, a steady composure that only deepened the impression of her readiness. That discipline was not lost on the council. In a setting where restraint often speaks louder than rhetoric, Catherine's calm was being read as the mark of a leader who understood the weight of the crown before even wearing it. By the time the final names were called, the result was no longer in doubt. Hand after hand rose in her favor, each one erasing any illusion that the vote would be close. Out of the dozens present, only one remained opposed, a loyal ally of Camilla, whose solitary defiance could do nothing to change the outcome. The rest had spoken with near unanimous clarity, the weight of the moment pressed down on the chamber. Even those who had long resisted change now sat in a kind of stunned acceptance, realizing they had witnessed a turning point that would be discussed in royal history for generations. Catherine's path to the role of future monarch regent was no longer a matter of speculation. It was now official, sanctioned by the body that could not be overruled. And then, with a voice that cut through the heavy silence, the council chair made the declaration that would ignite a royal eruption. The words were simple, but their impact was seismic. By authority of the Global Royal Council, Princess Catherine will assume the role of future monarch. They hung in the air, suspended like the toll of a great bell that could never be unheard. The phrasing was deliberate, restrained in tone, yet heavy with the unmistakable weight of history. It was not merely an announcement. It was a formal transfer of expectation, a rewriting of the monarchy's future, enshrined in the voice of the council's highest authority. For a heartbeat, there was silence that charged, breathless stillness before reaction surges into the open. Then, the chamber erupted in a swell of sound. Applause rang out from the majority of delegates, their approval measured but unmistakable. Alongside it came the rustle of shocked murmurs from those unprepared for the council to act with such decisiveness. Even the aides, trained to maintain composure, could not hide the flicker of surprise in their eyes. Some gasped quietly, others exchanged quick glances, aware that this moment would be dissected in every palace across the Commonwealth. Catherine rose slowly, as though the enormity of the moment demanded a deliberate acknowledgement. She stood tall, her hands resting calmly in front of her, and gave a measured nod to the council before speaking. Her voice carried the clarity of someone who understood both the privilege and the burden being placed upon her. She thanked the delegates for their trust, spoke of unity and service, and pledged her commitment to safeguarding the monarchy for generations to come. The words were gracious, but beneath them was an undeniable undercurrent. She was ready. Across the table, Camilla was unraveling in silence. At first, it was subtle, a tightening of the lips, a sharp inhale, a slight shake of the head, as though dismissing what had just been said. But then, it deepened. Those close enough to hear caught the faint murmur of words under her breath, curt and laced with disbelief. It was not simply that Catherine had been chosen. It was that this choice had been made in a way that left no room for reversal. The late Queen's hidden decree had been confirmed, amplified, and now immortalized in the eyes of the world. The tension between the two women crystallized in a single moment of eye contact. Catherine's gaze was steady, composed, offering no invitation for confrontation, but also no sign of retreat. Camilla's eyes, however, burned with a mix of wounded pride and something sharper, the kind of resolve born in the heat of betrayal. It was a silent exchange, but those watching could feel it, as if an unspoken challenge had passed between them. And then came the sound that broke the room's rhythm entirely, the screech of a chair's legs against the polished floor. Camilla had risen abruptly, her movement abrupt enough to draw every gaze toward her. She did not ask permission to leave. She did not disguise her intention. In that instant, the formality of the setting was shattered, replaced by the unmistakable presence of a personal storm brewing in full view of the world's most powerful royals. What happened next would be whispered about in royal corridors for years, a public display of defiance that no one could have predicted. Without a word to anyone, Camilla turned, her heels striking the marble floor like gunshots, and the entire hall fell silent as the Queen walked out on the council. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The echo of her steps ricocheted off the high ceilings, a sound that seemed louder than the declaration that had just been made. It was not the manner of a dignified royal departure. It was a rupture, a shattering of protocol in a place where even breathing seemed rehearsed. Gasps rippled through the delegates, followed by an awkward, suffocating silence. This was not supposed to happen. Not here. Not in this room where every gesture had been choreographed, every word weighed. To leave mid-session was to send a message so blatant that it could never be walked back. In an instant, centuries of tradition bowed to the raw pulse of emotion, and everyone in the room knew they were witnessing a moment that would carve its way into royal history. Catherine remained seated, her expression calm, her posture unbroken. Yet for those who knew her well, there was a flicker, just a flicker, in her eyes. It was not fear, nor was it guilt. It was something closer to awareness. The recognition that the choice the council had made was not merely political, it was personal. And in that personal space, a storm had just been unleashed. As Camilla neared the double doors, whispers began to weave through the chamber. Some leaned toward each other, wondering if this was a calculated move, a dramatic walkout meant to signal defiance and rally her allies. Others believed it was unfiltered reaction, a breaking point reached after years of carefully contained slights, now tipped over the edge by a single, decisive blow. No one knew for certain, but the air was thick with the knowledge that whatever the motive, the consequences would be far-reaching. Behind her, aides and staff scrambled, exchanging quick, anxious glances before hurrying to catch up. One clutched a phone to his ear, murmuring rapidly into it. Another slipped quietly out a side exit, no doubt to inform the king before the news reached him secondhand. Even among those who had tried to prepare for tension at this meeting, few had imagined this, a queen leaving in protest before the eyes of the world's most powerful royal representatives. The moment was caught, discreetly but unmistakably, by cameras positioned around the hall. While the official recording would never be released by the council, there were always other eyes, other lenses, other channels through which such an image could travel. And travel it would first through the private networks of royal staff, then into the hands of trusted journalists, and eventually into the unstoppable current of public opinion. But leaving the room didn't end the battle, it only moved it into the shadows, where the fiercest royal wars are fought. As the applause for Catherine faded in the council chamber, a very different kind of meeting was taking place in a private suite upstairs. Behind a door guarded by two aides who turned away prying eyes, Camilla sat surrounded by her closest advisors, the air inside the room thick with anger and disbelief. Gone was the polished restraint she had displayed in the council hall. Here, voices were raised, accusations flew, and the raw sting of humiliation was laid bare. She demanded to know how such a decision could have been allowed to happen under their watch. How had they not anticipated the full force of support for Catherine? And most of all, how had the late Queen's decree been unearthed without her knowledge? Her advisors, some defensive and others scrambling to shift blame, offered explanations about political momentum, about Catherine's cultivated alliances abroad, about the way the council had been quietly swayed over recent months. But Camilla's focus was no longer on explanations, it was on retaliation. In a voice low but sharp, she vowed to never let this stand. Those in the room understood it was not an empty statement. Camilla had survived decades of public hostility and institutional resistance. She had not done so by yielding when the tide turned against her. Phones came out quickly. Calls were placed to long-standing allies in Parliament, the ones who owed her favors or still saw her as the monarchy's most experienced stabilizer. Discreet messages were sent to contacts in certain Commonwealth capitals, testing the waters for dissent. The goal was not to reverse the council's vote immediately, that would be near impossible, but to sow doubt, to suggest that the decision was premature, that it undermined the king's role, that it risked fracturing the monarchy's image. Outside the suite, the first threads of a counter-narrative were already being spun. Sympathetic tabloids began to receive carefully worded leaks, framing the council's move as a rash political gamble driven by emotion rather than strategy. Headlines were drafted to imply that the king himself had been blindsided, his authority diminished by an overeager global body intent on fast-tracking change. None of this could undo the public declaration, but it could muddy the waters, and in royal politics, confusion is often the first step toward reversal. Meanwhile, Catherine was not idle. In a smaller, quieter room nearby, she met privately with supportive delegates, the very people who had cast their votes in her favor. There were no raised voices here, only measured conversations about the path ahead, about how to reinforce the legitimacy of the council's decision and ensure it could withstand any pushback. Her approach was not combative, but it was strategic. By the time she left the room, she had secured verbal commitments from several key figures to stand by the outcome, no matter what waves Camilla might stir in the weeks ahead. 2 meetings, 2 strategies, one focused on undermining, the other on fortifying. The battle had simply shifted from the floor of the council chamber to the shadowed corners, where royal power is truly contested. Yet, for all the scheming behind closed doors, the true test would come when the king himself stepped into the fray. For King Charles, the decision was a knife to the heart, torn between his wife's pride and the undeniable will of the global royal alliance. The news reached him not in the council chamber, but in the middle of a delicate diplomatic meeting, where the weight of international expectations already pressed on his shoulders. A discreet aide slipped him a folded note, its message brief, but devastating in its clarity. The council had voted overwhelmingly in Catherine's favor. The title of future monarch was hers. The words were few, yet they carried the force of an earthquake. For a long moment, Charles said nothing. Those who know him well would later describe his expression as one of quiet resignation, but the truth was more complex. He had spent decades defending Camilla from the fiercest waves of public scorn, standing by her through the cold scrutiny of the press, the private judgments of his own family, and the unshakable comparisons to Diana. In his mind, her place at his side was not merely a personal choice. It was a commitment, forged in hardship, tested by time, and reinforced against all odds. To see her leave, the council chamber in public defiance was painful enough. To know why she had walked out made it infinitely worse. And yet, even as his loyalty to Camilla pulled at him, another truth could not be ignored. Catherine's name had become synonymous with stability, diplomacy, and an authenticity that resonated far beyond the palace walls. In the eyes of the world, she was not simply a future queen consort. She was the embodiment of the monarchy's evolution. Her image was untarnished by scandal, her popularity unshaken even in the harshest political climates. Charles knew better than anyone that in an era where public opinion could make or break royal authority, Catherine's approval was not just an asset, it was a lifeline. In the hours after receiving the news, he retreated into private discussions with a small circle of trusted confidants. Some urged him to push back against the council's decision, to defend the dignity of his queen and reassert his own authority as reigning monarch. But the more seasoned voices in the room counseled caution. "Embrace the decision," one advisor told him plainly. "The council has spoken for the Commonwealth. This is bigger than pride. It's about survival." Those words struck Charles harder than the announcement itself, for they hinted at a truth he could not ignore. This was no longer just about family politics. It was about securing the monarchy's future in a world where its very relevance was under constant question. The king wrestled with the choice through the night. He could shield Camilla and risk alienating a public already leaning toward Catherine, or he could stand behind the council's decision and risk driving a wedge deeper into his marriage. Neither path was without pain, but by dawn, he knew which course he had to take. He would address the matter publicly, not as a concession, but as a deliberate act of leadership, framing it as unity, as continuity, as the will of the monarchy itself. It was a moment that would require every ounce of his composure, for one wrong word could turn reconciliation into ruin. And when the king finally spoke, his words were not what either woman expected. Before the world's cameras, King Charles did what no one thought he could, blessing Catherine's new role while holding Camilla's hand. The setting was formal, the air heavy with anticipation, and every word was weighed before it left his lips. He spoke slowly, deliberately, as though aware that this moment would be replayed for decades to come. In his address, he honored Camilla, acknowledging her years of steadfast service and the personal sacrifices she had made to stand beside him. His words were warm enough to shield her from public humiliation, yet careful not to undermine what the council had decided. And then came the pivot, the part that signaled the monarchy's path forward. With steady conviction, he endorsed Catherine's appointment as future monarch, framing it not as a challenge to the present, but as an investment in the future, a decision made in unity for the good of the crown and the Commonwealth. Catherine's response was as measured as it was gracious. She rose, bowed her head slightly toward the king, and thanked both him and the council for the trust placed in her. There was no trace of triumph in her voice, only humility and a call for unity. She spoke of service, of the weight of responsibility, and of her commitment to safeguarding the monarchy's values while embracing the evolution it must undergo to survive in a changing world. It was the kind of statement that silenced detractors, not through argument, but through its sheer sincerity. Camilla stood beside Charles, her posture impeccable, her smile restrained. To the cameras, she was every inch the dignified queen, offering support for her husband's message and nodding in approval at Catherine's words. But to those who knew her well, the truth was, there in her eyes a flicker of something unhealed, the shadow of a wound that no public show of unity could erase. She had been forced to stand in the same frame as the woman who now embodied the monarchy's future. And while she endured it without faltering, the moment was not without cost. The global reaction was immediate. Headlines across continents hailed Catherine's humility and the king's deft handling of a moment that could have split the royal family in two. Images of the three of them standing together were splashed across front pages, framed as proof that the monarchy could adapt and present a united front even in times of profound internal strain. Approval ratings soared. Commentators spoke of a renewed era and a monarchy reborn for the modern age. Yet, behind the praise, some insiders whispered that the apparent peace was fragile, a truce born of necessity, not reconciliation. The public had been given a moment of unity, but unity in the royal family has often been a temporary state. When the formalities ended, the king stepped back, allowing Catherine and Camilla to leave side by side. Cameras caught them walking together, their expressions calm, but their gazes fixed ahead, never turning toward each other. There were no exchanged words, no subtle smiles, just the quiet, poised choreography of two women bound by duty, but divided by what had brought them here. Because in the royal family, the end of one chapter is never the end of the story. It's only the quiet before the next battle begins. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.